In the shadowed corners of history, families often carried secrets that never reached the light of day. New England, with its cold forests, isolated towns, and strict traditions, became fertile ground for whispers of curses, betrayals, and unexplainable horrors. Among these haunted bloodlines, one name stood out, a family whose descent into madness, superstition, and tragedy left scars across New Hampshire. Their story is not merely one of history, but of something darker. The origins of the Grimthorne family's curse begin not in the ordinary annals of New England's settlement, but in the strange undercurrents of fear, superstition, and whispered bargains that traveled with the earliest colonists who dared to carve their lives into the cold wilderness of New Hampshire. The family arrived in the early 1700s, their patriarch, Elias Grimthorne, a man of unusual ambition and stern resolve, leading his kin into the northern woods, where land was cheap and unclaimed, but burdened with rumors that the soil itself resisted those who tried to tame it. While most settlers struggled to coax life out of the rocky ground, Elias prospered in ways that seemed almost unnatural. Neighbors watched as his crops thrived when theirs withered, his herds fattened while theirs starved. His coffers grew heavy with coin, though his labor appeared no greater than any other. From the very beginning, whispers circulated that his prosperity was not born from toil alone, but from something older, something the Puritans did not dare speak of openly. The settlement records speak plainly of Elias Grimthorne as a respected man of stature, but folklore clings to the margins of his story. Some said he had brought with him a book, a weathered volume bound in leather that no one outside the family was ever permitted to touch. Others claimed that his late-night wanderings into the forest, alone and unarmed, marked meetings not with fellow men but with something less human. The native tribes who had once lived upon the land told tales of spirits that lingered in the deep woods, spirits angered by broken promises and the spilling of blood. It was said Elias traded with these unseen forces, offering sacrifices that bought him wealth and security, though what he promised in return was never clear. His first wife, Margaret, bore him 3 sons and 2 daughters, and though they prospered in material fortune, shadows hung over the family even then. Margaret died suddenly after her youngest daughter's birth, her body found cold and pale, her lips drawn as though she had tasted something bitter. Local women whispered of poison, though none dared accuse Elias directly. Within a year, he remarried a woman of mysterious origin, said to have come from the coast of Maine, where stories of sea witches and healers were not uncommon. With her arrival, the Grimthorne name began to carry both reverence and unease. The new wife was rumored to practice arts of her own, keeping charms hidden in the beams of the house, scattering strange powders into the hearth fire, and muttering incantations in a tongue no one recognized. As the family grew in power, their connection to the land deepened in uncanny ways. The boundaries of their estate stretched further into the forest, and though neighbors attempted to buy or claim parcels near them, crops failed, livestock sickened, and children fell ill until the land was abandoned back into Grimthorne hands. Some swore that Elias had drawn a circle of ownership not through lawful deeds, but through rights that bound the soil itself to his bloodline. The house that rose on Black Hollow Hill became a symbol of both wealth and dread. Its tall windows seemed always lit at night, even when no candles could be seen, and travelers on the nearby road reported hearing strange sounds, chanting, cries, or the shriek of animals carried on the wind. What marked the true beginning of their curse, however, was an incident during the colonial wars. Records state that Elias led a small band of settlers in a skirmish against raiding parties, but legend paints the story differently. It was said he captured not just enemies of war, but also women and children, and in his hunger for power, he offered them in sacrifice deep within the forest. Blood spilled upon sacred ground awakened something that would not rest again. From that moment on, the Grimthorne's prosperity came paired with misfortune of another kind. Children born frail and sickly, sons lost to madness, daughters driven to despair. One son is said to have raved for nights about figures moving through his chamber, their faces hidden, their whispers demanding he follow them into the woods. Another daughter disappeared altogether, her bed left empty, her window wide open though no tracks were found outside. The surrounding townships grew wary, but the Grimthornes were too powerful to confront openly. Elias grew older, yet his vigor seemed unnatural, lasting well beyond the years of other men his age. Some whispered he had traded not just for wealth but for time itself, extending his life by giving pieces of his lineage in return. Each untimely death within the family seemed less like misfortune and more like a toll being paid to something unseen. His descendants inherited not only his land, but also the unease that clung to his name. By the mid-18th century, the family stood as one of the wealthiest in the region, yet no feast or gathering of theirs was ever free from unease. Servants told of doors opening on their own, of shadows moving where no one walked, of a chill that fell upon rooms even with the hearth blazing. Folklore tells that Elias died in his bed, but not peacefully. Witnesses described a night filled with screams so piercing that even neighbors down the hill awoke in terror. When the family finally entered his chamber, they found him pale, eyes wide with horror, his mouth twisted into a final silent cry. Though his body was cold, the room itself was said to be unnaturally hot, as though flames had just passed through. After his burial, strange lights were seen above the graveyard, and animals avoided the plot altogether. But though Elias was gone, the curse, or pact, depending on which story one believes, did not end with him. It seeped into the blood of his descendants, staining the Grimthorne name with a shadow that would grow darker with each generation, a shadow that the land of New Hampshire itself seemed unable to swallow. The story of the Grimthorne family cannot be told without examining the ancestral sin that clung to them, a weight that seemed to shape the destiny of every generation that followed. At the heart of this stain stood Elias Grimthorne, a man whose rise to influence in colonial New Hampshire was as ruthless as it was mysterious. He was not remembered only as a cunning landowner or a successful farmer, but as a figure who blurred the line between ambition and cruelty. The land he claimed was not simply taken from wilderness but wrenched from those who had lived on it long before, and while the official records describe him as a participant in frontier conflicts, oral traditions whispered that Elias went far beyond what duty demanded. Where others fought to protect, he fought to dominate, leaving behind stories of betrayals and merciless acts that marked him as a man feared even by his allies. During the colonial wars, while many settlers prayed for safety and survival, Elias seemed to thrive. Neighbors noticed that his holdings grew after each conflict, as though bloodshed directly fertilized his fortune. The capture of enemy combatants was expected, yet rumors insisted Elias did not always deliver his prisoners to authorities. Instead, some disappeared without explanation, their names vanishing from ledgers and journals, their fates lost to speculation. Whispers painted a darker picture, that Elias offered lives in exchange for his family's unnatural prosperity, performing rites in the shadowed woods where screams were carried off by the night wind. Though such accusations were never proven, the very persistence of the stories suggests that something in his behavior unsettled those around him. The true ancestral sin, however, was not only rooted in violence against outsiders, but also in how Elias treated his own kin. He viewed family not as something sacred, but as currency, tools to be used in his pursuit of power. Marriages were arranged not for love, but for advantage. Children were raised under the weight of stern expectations, and those who failed to meet them were punished with cold severity. One tale describes how Elias, upon discovering that a son refused to inherit the family's land in favor of becoming a minister, disowned him entirely, erasing his name from all records. Local accounts claim that this son vanished soon after, never seen again, and some whispered he had been offered as part of the same bargains that fueled his father's gains. Daughters fared little better, married off to neighboring families whose alliances served Elias's interests, yet even these unions often ended in misfortune. Brides widowed young, infants dying without cause, households plagued by illness that seemed to follow the Grimthorne blood wherever it mingled. The house on Black Hollow Hill itself seemed to bear witness to these sins. The patriarch's stern portrait hung in the great hall, his gaze so piercing that visitors reported feeling judged even as they passed beneath it. Servants claimed that the eyes seemed to follow them, and when lightning storms shook the windows, the painting appeared to flicker with an almost living presence. To the Grimthorne children growing up under his shadow, this was a constant reminder that their lives were not their own, but bound to the choices Elias had made long before. Every misstep, every whisper of rebellion was met with the heavy weight of expectation that their family's legacy was something more than ordinary, something both powerful and dangerous. As the years went on, the ancestral sin seemed to shift from being the secret of one man to becoming a shared inheritance. Each descendant carried with them not only the land and wealth Elias secured, but also the whispers of what had been done to secure them. The curse did not always manifest in immediate misfortune. Instead, it unfolded gradually, like rot beneath the surface of wood. Some family members appeared to live normal lives, yet tragedy often struck in ways that mirrored the sins of their ancestor. Sons were born strong but turned to madness in their youth. Daughters who married into other households saw their fortunes collapse inexplicably. Crops grown on Grimthorne land flourished, but when shared with others, they seemed to wither and spoil, as though the soil itself refused to benefit anyone beyond the cursed bloodline. Elias's sin was not only in violence but in arrogance, the belief that he could bind unseen forces to his will without consequence. Town records reveal little, but the folklore preserves a chilling image of a man who believed himself untouchable, immune to the rules of both church and nature. He was said to laugh when accused of blasphemy, telling others that it was not God who fed his children, but the land he had conquered. He mocked the fears of his neighbors while secretly fueling them, for he knew the power of superstition could be used to maintain control. Yet in mocking what he did not understand, Elias may have sealed the fate of all who bore his name, for those forces he bargained with were not known for their mercy. The weight of his ancestral sin shaped the generations that followed in ways both visible and hidden. Families who married into the Grimthorne line often spoke of a chill that settled over their homes, as if a shadow had entered with the union. Servants recorded sudden accidents, fires that sparked without cause, horses that panicked in empty fields, children waking at night screaming of a man in the corner who watched them silently. Some claimed these were the echoes of Elias himself, restless and unable to let go of the pact he had forged. Others believed they were the voices of those sacrificed, bound forever to the family that had betrayed them. Whatever the truth, the Grimthorne descendants grew up in a world where their ancestors' actions were both legend and curse, their lives shaped by choices made long before their births, a stain that no prayer nor fortune could wash away. The generations of madness within the Grimthorne family became one of the most chilling aspects of their history, a slow unraveling that threaded itself through each branch of their bloodline until it was impossible to separate inheritance from affliction. What began as whispers of odd behavior in Elias Grimthorne's children grew into undeniable patterns, repeated with such regularity that even the most skeptical neighbors began to accept that something unnatural plagued the family. Madness seemed to bloom in the halls of Black Hollow Hill, an unseen contagion that took hold of sons and daughters alike, twisting their minds into shadows of despair, violence, or delirium. The earliest cases were subtle, marked by melancholy and strange visions. One of Elias's grandsons, Thomas, was remembered as a bright child who spoke eloquently even before he could write, but by his teenage years he grew obsessed with the woods that bordered the estate. He would vanish for hours, sometimes days, returning with mud-stained clothes and wild stories of voices in the trees that called his name. At first his family dismissed it as imagination, but soon the stories became darker. He claimed the voices whispered secrets of death and warned him of fires and storms before they occurred. Villagers whispered that Thomas was touched by the devil, and his sudden disappearance one winter night only fueled the superstition. His body was never recovered, though some swore they saw him wandering the forest long after, pale and thin, his eyes glowing with feverish light. Others in the family were not so fortunate as to vanish. Many descended into prolonged madness that consumed their lives entirely. Records from the mid-18th century describe a Grimthorne daughter named Eliza, whose laughter echoed through the halls of the mansion even in the dead of night. She spoke in riddles, recited passages from her grandfather's forbidden book, and claimed she saw spirits walking the corridors. Servants reported that her presence grew unbearable, for she would stare at them for hours without blinking, muttering prayers backward under her breath. Eventually, she was locked away in an attic chamber where she scratched strange symbols into the wooden walls until her fingers bled. When she finally died, the room was sealed. But decades later, workmen reported finding the marks still etched deep into the beams, as though burned there by something more than human hands. The madness was not confined to individuals. Entire branches of the family were marred by it. Marriages brought no relief, for the affliction spread even to those who married into the Grimthorne line. A cousin who had once been admired for his steady character began wandering the roads at night barefoot, singing hymns in a voice so broken it frightened passers-by. Another descendant, Jonathan Grimthorne, a respected magistrate in his early years, shocked the town when he suddenly accused half the village of conspiring against him. His paranoia grew so intense that he barricaded himself inside the estate, convinced that invisible enemies lurked in every shadow. When the doors were finally forced open, he was found huddled in a corner, his fingernails torn and bloody from scratching at the stone floor, his lips moving as though speaking to someone unseen. He never spoke coherently again. Patterns of tragedy repeated across the decades, often with eerie similarities. Children would cry out at night, describing the same faceless figure standing over their beds. Young men would complain of whispers that drove them to anger and violence. Women in the family often fell into states of despair, their journals filled with desperate pleas to escape an influence they could not name. One entry, preserved in a local archive, describes a Grimthorne mother who wrote that she could feel the weight of eyes upon me even when alone, as though the walls themselves remembered sins that my body has not committed but my blood cannot deny. Within weeks of writing those words, she drowned in the family well, her body discovered floating with her arms outstretched as though reaching for something just beyond her grasp. The curse of madness also seemed to manifest physically in the house itself. Visitors reported hearing laughter echo through empty halls or seeing fleeting figures vanish around corners. Servants whispered of mirrors that reflected faces not their own, of windows that showed not the outside world but dark forests unfamiliar to the land. The Grimthornes themselves often claimed the house was alive, feeding on their minds as much as their bodies, and that leaving its walls did not bring escape but only carried the shadows with them. Some historians have argued that the so-called madness was nothing more than inherited illness, a lineage afflicted by genetic disorders of the mind. Yet even skeptics cannot easily dismiss the consistency of the phenomena or the way in which it echoed the sins of Elias himself. Madness in the Grimthorne family rarely took ordinary forms. It came with visions, prophecies, and an uncanny sense of being watched or manipulated by something beyond human understanding. The afflicted often described the same presence, a tall shadow that loomed just beyond the edge of sight, a voice that tempted them with promises of release if only they would surrender themselves fully. The chilling detail is that these accounts spanned generations, with individuals separated by decades reporting nearly identical experiences. As the family tree spread, the madness traveled with it, leaving no branch untouched. Those who attempted to escape the Grimthorne name by changing their identities or moving far from New Hampshire often met tragic ends regardless. One descendant who relocated to Boston reportedly threw himself into the harbor after weeks of raving about the dark man who waits. Another fled as far as Virginia, but was found years later, wandering destitute, muttering about debts that could never be paid. The descent into madness was not sudden but gradual, a slow corruption that seemed to seep into the minds of the Grimthornes from childhood until it consumed them entirely. Each generation added new tales to the grim tapestry until the family name itself became synonymous with insanity and ruin. Neighbors came to view the Grimthorne line as cursed not merely by rumor but by proof written in the shattered minds and broken bodies of its members. The once powerful lineage that Elias had built through ambition and sin had become a grotesque legacy of delirium and despair, a dynasty where madness was as certain as death, and the whispers of the past grew louder with every passing year. The house on Black Hollow Hill stood not just as a home for the Grimthorne family, but as the physical heart of their curse, a looming presence that became both sanctuary and prison to generations who lived within its walls. Built in the mid-1700s, it was unlike the modest homes of neighboring settlers, towering with a severity that struck fear in the hearts of those who passed by. Its gabled roof cut into the sky like a blade, and its windows, tall and narrow, seemed less like places to let in the light, and more like watchful eyes staring out across the valley. The locals claimed the house was cursed even before the first stone was laid, for the land it stood upon had long been avoided by both settlers and the native tribes who spoke of restless spirits that wandered the hill after dark. Elias Grimthorne chose it deliberately, as though he sought to root his family directly in the soil where shadows walked, and from the moment the mansion was completed, it became the subject of dark whispers and fearful glances. The house was not merely large, but unnaturally so for its time, as if it had been built for purposes beyond shelter. The halls stretched too long, the staircases twisted into strange angles, and the rooms often seemed colder than they should have been, even with roaring fires in their hearths. Servants complained of drafts that moved against the wind and of doors that opened by themselves. Strange noises were commonplace, groans in the floorboards when no one walked them, knocks on walls that seemed to come from inside the plaster, and the faint sound of footsteps pacing overhead even when the upper rooms were empty. Visitors often left quickly, unsettled by the oppressive silence that seemed to cling to the place, a silence broken only by the occasional echo that seemed to come from nowhere. Folklore holds that Elias filled the foundation with objects not meant to be buried, bones, charms, and the remnants of his secret rites. Some said he laid the house as a great altar, its architecture designed to channel forces unseen. Whether by design or by consequence, the house absorbed the energies of every tragedy that befell the family, becoming more alive with every generation. By the early 1800s, the mansion was spoken of in hushed tones by townsfolk, who avoided passing it after dark. Riders on the nearby road told of lights glowing in the upper windows long after the household had gone to bed, and some claimed to hear distant screams carried down the hill. Farmers ploughing nearby fields reported seeing figures at the windows, standing motionless for hours, even when the house was said to be empty. Inside, the house's rooms bore the weight of the family's madness. The great hall where Elias's portrait hung seemed always colder than the rest of the home, and no fire could warm it for long. Guests described the sensation of being watched while they dined, their eyes drawn again and again to the painted figure whose gaze never faltered. The attic, where Eliza Grimthorne had been locked away in her fits of madness, became infamous for the strange symbols carved into its walls, marks that no amount of sanding or plaster could fully conceal. Servants who were forced to clean the room swore that whispers rose from the walls themselves, low murmurs in a tongue they could not understand. The basement, with its earthen floor and stone walls, carried the strongest fear, for it was there that Elias was said to have performed his earliest rites. Shadows clung heavily in that space, and even the bravest refused to linger there after dark. The surrounding community grew to believe the house itself was cursed, not simply because of its inhabitants, but because it seemed to warp the world around it. Livestock that grazed too near would sicken and die. Children who wandered onto the property spoke of nightmares for weeks after, dreams of dark hallways and unseen figures pulling them into the depths of the house. During thunderstorms, the mansion seemed to draw lightning unnaturally often, bolts striking the weather vane atop its roof with such force that the hill glowed with electric fire. Yet the structure endured, standing firm as if it resisted destruction, as though some power anchored it more firmly than stone and wood could alone. The house's reputation grew to such infamy that even generations later, locals told stories of travelers who sought shelter at Black Hollow Hill, only to flee in the night. One tale speaks of a peddler who entered during a snowstorm, welcomed by the family and given food, but who was discovered days later wandering the woods barefoot, incoherent and babbling about a staircase that never ended. Another story recalls a group of children who dared each other to approach the front steps at dusk. Though they never went inside, they swore they saw a figure standing in the upstairs window, watching them with a pale face pressed against the glass. And when they fled, they heard footsteps pounding on the stairs within, though no one else was known to be home. For the Grimthornes themselves, the house became both inheritance and curse. Many family members tried to leave, but they always returned, drawn back either by duty or by something more sinister that would not let them go. Letters written by descendants spoke of feeling the house's pull, a gnawing unease when away that only ceased upon their return. Some described dreams of the mansion calling to them, its long corridors stretching endlessly, promising rest if only they would come back. For those who remained, the house seemed to consume them slowly. Illnesses worsened within its walls, grief lingered longer, and madness deepened as though the very timbers of the place whispered incessantly into the minds of its inhabitants. By the late 19th century, the mansion was a hollow shell of its former grandeur, its paint peeling, its windows broken, but its presence no less oppressive. Townsfolk crossed themselves when passing it, and some claimed to see faint lights flickering even when the house was said to be abandoned. Travelers continued to report strange sightings. A woman in white wandering the balcony, a man in old colonial garb staring out at the road, voices drifting down the hill on moonless nights. The estate became a landmark of fear, its very name a reminder of the Grimthorne legacy. It was not merely a house, but a monument to a curse, a structure steeped in death, madness and shadows that seemed to deepen with every passing year, the heart of the Grimthorne descent, and the echoing chamber of every sin their family had ever committed. The legacy of shadows that the Grimthorne family left behind in New Hampshire is one that cannot be erased by time, for even after the bloodline faded, their presence lingered in memory, in folklore, and in the silent decay of the land they once claimed. Their story did not end with a final descendant passing peacefully into obscurity, nor with the simple crumbling of their house into ruin. Instead, the remnants of their existence clung to the valley like a cold mist, drifting into the lives of those who came after. The family's decline became a cautionary tale, whispered in taverns, told to children at night, and repeated by old men who swore they had seen things with their own eyes. The shadows of the Grimthornes became a kind of inheritance not for their own children, but for the community that had lived in their presence for centuries. As the 19th century closed, the last known members of the family seemed to vanish one by one. Some died without explanation, their bodies discovered in ways that only deepened the sense of unease surrounding the name. A Grimthorne heir was found lifeless at the base of the hill, his expression frozen in terror, his hands clutching at his throat as if something unseen had strangled him. A cousin disappeared without a trace, leaving her bedclothes scattered as though she had risen in the middle of the night and simply walked into the dark. Another relative left for Boston, but was soon brought back in a coffin with vague reports of sudden madness and violent fits that ended in his death. Each passing stripped the family tree of another branch until only silence remained. And yet that silence was anything but comforting. The townspeople who lived near the ruins of the Grimthorne estate spoke of the house refusing to die even as its inhabitants did. Though roofs caved in and timbers rotted, the structure itself never fully collapsed, as though some will kept it upright against decay. Farmers avoided the land, insisting that crops planted too near would wither overnight or sprout into strange, stunted forms. Hunters claimed no animal would cross the property, and those who forced their dogs onto the grounds reported the animals trembling, whining, and refusing to move forward. Children dared each other to approach the gates but ran in fright before setting foot inside, swearing they heard voices or saw figures moving behind broken windows. Even as the Grimthorne family faded into absence, the shadow of their name lingered like a stain that could not be scrubbed away. Legends grew in the absence of fact. And soon it was said that the Grimthornes had not truly vanished at all, but had been swallowed by the very curse they carried. Some claimed the final descendants were taken by the same spirits Elias had bargained with, their souls claimed as payment for debts long overdue. Others suggested the family had hidden themselves away within the house, their forms twisted by madness, living as wraith-like remnants behind shuttered windows. A few went so far as to say the Grimthornes walked still, not as men and women but as shadows that slipped from tree to tree on moonless nights, watching, waiting, and whispering among themselves in voices too faint for the living to understand. Historians tried to make sense of what remained. Court records showed the estate changing hands in the early 20th century, though each new owner abandoned it quickly, citing misfortune, illness, or inexplicable accidents. One owner's wife reportedly threw herself from the balcony, convinced that voices in the walls told her she would never be free. Another family fled in the night after just 3 months, claiming their children woke screaming of a man standing at their bedside, pointing them toward the woods. Even those who tried to demolish the house found obstacles. Workers quit abruptly, tools broke without cause, and machines failed at the edge of the property. Local rumor had it that one crew who attempted to tear down the eastern wing left after discovering fresh blood seeping through the stone foundation, though no animal or human body was ever found. The legacy extended beyond the physical remnants of the house. In nearby villages, the Grimthorne name became a curse in itself. To call someone a Grimthorne was to accuse them of carrying darkness, of inviting misfortune. Superstitions arose that anyone who spoke ill of the family too boldly would suffer a mysterious accident, and many avoided even mentioning the name after dusk. In this way, the Grimthorne's shadow was woven into daily life, not as a living presence but as a lingering dread, shaping behavior long after the family line had ended. Teachers told their students never to walk near Black Hollow Hill. Parents warned children that those who misbehaved would be taken by the spirits of the Grimthornes. Travelers passing through the valley were told not to linger after dark, lest the shadows of the cursed family follow them home. As time moved on, the house became an object of fascination for outsiders, especially those drawn to ghost stories and the macabre. Writers, journalists, and even paranormal investigators made their way to the crumbling estate, each adding their own interpretations to the legacy. Some described the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes, of hearing footsteps that matched their own, of sudden cold winds that cut through heavy coats as though the house itself exhaled. A few left convinced that the Grimthorne's spirits remained, tethered to the land by the sins of their patriarch and the madness of their descendants. Others insisted that the house was not haunted by spirits at all, but by the curse itself, a kind of living memory that could not be erased, replaying the tragedies of the past upon anyone foolish enough to step inside. Yet for all the speculation, one truth remained. The Grimthorne family had left behind more than wealth, more than a crumbling house on a lonely hill. They had left behind a legacy of fear, a shadow that seeped into the soil and into the minds of those who came after. It was not only their madness, their violence, or their cursed pacts that survived, but the sense that some debts do not die with the debtor. In New Hampshire, the name Grimthorne became a story told in hushed voices, a reminder that history is not always something buried neatly in the past. Sometimes it lingers, stretching its fingers forward, casting shadows that darken every generation that dares to remember.